let's start off with this one. So my very first one that I'm choosing, start my top 10, is the original Nintendo controller. It was a toss up between the Nintendo 64 controller and the Nintendo controller. And it doesn't mean that it's bad necessarily. And remember, this is a top 10. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just the order of use that I would use the controllers if I had to use a controller, right? So the Nintendo controller, it came out in 1983. I think that's a pretty good start with the Nintendo controller. My problem with the Nintendo controller and why it doesn't move up, because I know there's a lot of people that's like, yo, that's like the best controller. It's just so small. If you haven't played it in a long time, if you haven't played the Nintendo and you're an adult right now, I dare you to go back and play with that Nintendo controller. I dare you. If you haven't played since 1990 something or 1980 something and you're an adult right now, go back and use that controller. Just go back and try it. It is extremely small and it hurts your freaking hands. And it's like, yo, why is this control? There's nothing to grip. There's nothing, you can't grip it at all. So it's like, dang. So that's why that starts with 10. I would normally have something like the Nintendo 64 controller. It was just so wonky. It was so freaking weird. They tried, but it was just too weird. I think the Nintendo controller, the Nintendo 64 was the second. Wait, let me think. Was the 64 controller come out for the PlayStation controller? The DualShock? I can't remember who came out with the analog stick first. Was it Nintendo or PlayStation? I can't remember. Yeah, see, you even said it. It was fun. Then I pulled out the turbo because the turbo controller is just a little bit bigger. But that 64 controller was a little wonky. That's why I didn't make my list. But this regular Nintendo controller, it's a good controller. It's a great controller. But it's just really small, especially if your hands are bigger and you're not a child anymore, you know? It's definitely made for people with little hands. Definitely played with people with little hands. Moving on. And the next controller, I would say the Atari controller. The Atari did an excellent job recreating the arcade feel, even though you didn't have the arcade experience. The arcade experience was brought home, but the visuals were off. So I know some people are like, Atari. Yes, Atari. If you go and get that controller and work with it just a little bit, the Atari controller, it actually doesn't feel bad. It just only has one button. You just got to understand and remember the times that it was in, but it's responsive. It's extremely responsive. And again, it gives you that same joystick experience. Hey, what's up, Mark? How's it going? He said Nintendo did the first analog for after purchase. PlayStation was the first to give it with console. Boom. Thank you, Under the Bridge Productions. I appreciate that, man. All right, so moving on. So that was 10, 9, no, we're on 8. We're on 8. Here you go. So my next controller that I have on here, and understand my reasoning behind this. A lot of this isn't because they're bad controllers. It's a combination of things. It's like, hey, why do I use it? How do I use it? And then it's, is it a knockoff, right? And the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, Nintendo does everything right with this controller. It's a lovely controller. But it is what it is. It's a knockoff controller of a bunch of other things, from the PlayStation to the Xbox to all that stuff. It's all the stuff combined and making it right. But is this the controller that I would normally use? No, this is my go-to. Like, even when I play my Nintendo Switch, typically when I'm playing the game this is not my go-to controller. It's a different controller. No, my voice is just a little hoarse, Mark. I'm okay. But this is not my go-to controller. I typically use a different one, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, but yeah, so that's number 8. That's number 8 for us. I think that's number 8. 10, 9. Yeah, that's 8. Let's move on to 7. What's 7? Boom. The original Xbox 360 controller. So, all right, you guys are going like, yo, your list is a little wonky. Give it a second. When you start seeing what my top 3 is, you be like, okay, I'll give it a ride. This is what you prefer to use. But this Xbox 360 controller was the first time I felt comfortable playing with the controller. You know, like everything just felt right. As far as Xbox goes. So like, we had the Xbox, the original Xbox. We had the Duke controller. Everybody remember that big old controller? It was freaking huge, man. And then they made it a little bit smaller, but it really wasn't it. So when it came with the 360 and they came out with this controller here, I was so freaking happy, and it fit in my hand. It was the first time that Xbox really gave you a wireless controller to utilize. Everything else was wired with the Xbox, but the 360, it was the first time that Xbox gave you a wireless controller. And I love this controller. It fit perfectly in my hand. And personally, I think Xbox could have continued with this controller. I prefer the 360 controller over the Xbox One controller. Again, that's just me. The Xbox One, it's a little heavy. It's a little heavy, and I don't think I like that. But this was done perfectly. And as you notice, kind of going back to what I was saying with the Switch controller, I'm sitting here like, yo, freaking, it's the exact same layout, but they kind of smooth some areas, and that's why I can't give it as much love as I was giving as I'm getting ready to give these other controllers. The next controller, the Dreamcast controller. Now, hear me out. The reason why this is a little bit higher than all the other ones, if you really look at the Dreamcast controller, is the reason why the Xbox controller looks the way it does. Quick history here. History lesson. The Dreamcast, when it came out, it worked with Microsoft. It had Microsoft software in it. You never had a Dreamcast? Oh, you're missing out. You're missing out. I think the Dreamcast is still worth getting today if you can find one and find the right games to go along with it. The Dreamcast was not a bad console. It was just launched very badly. But if you look at the Dreamcast here, if you just look at it, and look at the Dreamcast, what does that remind you of? No, you know what? I'll tell you. It reminds you of the Xbox Duke controller. This is where they get the analog stick to be above the D button, where the PlayStation has their D-pad. They have their D-pad above the analog stick, so the analog stick is in between the buttons, and then it's practically the same shape as the Duke controller. But that's why we have the Xbox controller that we got for the original Xbox, because Sega worked really, really closely with Microsoft. I don't know if you guys remember, well, with Microsoft, they had their web browser on the Dreamcast, and they worked very, very closely. So when Sega pulled out, Microsoft stepped in. So technically, in a sense, it's the Xbox is the spiritual successor to Sega. Does that make any sense on technical terms? Sega just like, we don't feel like investing this money and this. Hey, you could take some of these ideas and run with it and do it. You might do a better job than we do. That's pretty much what happened. That's why originally you saw Sonic the Hedgehog on the Xbox and not on PlayStation immediately. You originally saw it on the Xbox, but neither here nor there. It's where it's at because I want it there. So what is that? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. That's number 6. All right, let's move on. The next controller we're going to use. Oh, I didn't know that, Mark. I didn't realize they're supposed to do it together. I got to look that up. The next controller, we're on number 5. Super Nintendo controller. Now, the Super Nintendo controller had a first. It had a first. It had a first. And the first thing that the Super Nintendo did, Nintendo had a lot of firsts. But I digress. The Super Nintendo, one of the first things is done. Shoulder buttons. Yeah, y'all didn't realize that. You know, Nintendo originally was the first group of guys that put the L button and the R button on the shoulders. But again, this wouldn't be my go-to controller. It wouldn't be my go-to controller. Again, going back and playing with it, I remember going I got the Retron 5, right? And the Retron 5 plays Sega, Super Nintendo.
I got drip for sale. I got drip for sale. I got drip for sale.
Yo, thanks for that follow. I appreciate that. Is that Tattoo Lovers? Yo, thank you so much. But I have a Retron 5. It plays a Sega, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Famicom, Game Boy Color, Game Boy. It plays all those different games, right? I was like, yeah, I'm gonna buy a Super Nintendo controller. I really like that controller, and I'm gonna play it with my Retron 5. I bought one, and again, it goes back to, I didn't realize how small the controller was. So as an adult, it makes my hands cramp.
Thank you for becoming a member.
Oh, no doubt. Cool, Tattoo. I appreciate you. But yeah, it made my hands cramp. It made my hands cramp a lot. So that's why it's a little bit lower on my list here. So yeah, the Super Nintendo controller is number 5. But it did have a lot of firsts. The next one. Now this one, you really got to hear me out on this one. Number 4 for me. Hey, what's up, Boxer? Number 4 for me is the Sega Genesis 6-button controller. I have both of these controllers in the picture on purpose, all right? The very first thing is Sega. I love that Sega made a larger controller. They made a larger controller, and originally most Sega controllers had 3 buttons. This was my second console that I had. I had the original Nintendo, and then I had a Sega Genesis for my second console. And the 3-button controller was great. It didn't make you go back and grab one of those. You're like, oh, okay, this is cool. This feels right. But what I was about to say Nintendo. What Sega did was, instead of doing shoulder buttons, they made sure that all 6 of the buttons were able to be used right there at arm's reach. Because like when you're playing games like Street Fighter and you play it on the Super Nintendo, it's very difficult to do quarter circle, whatever you want to do, punch, kick, whatever, on that left shoulder there. It's really, really hard. Can you do it? Yeah. But it's really hard to kind of get that coordination with your fingers on that game, right? But Sega, they were smart, and they said, we're going to put all the buttons right there at thumb's reach. And I like that. That's good. And it didn't, even though the Sega Genesis 6-button controller was a little bit smaller, I didn't mind it, because the way it curved, it fit in your hands just right. And I love that it fit in your hands just right. Oh, you like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games? Yeah, that wasn't a bad game. It wasn't better than Turtle in Time, though, but it wasn't a bad game. Oh, but yeah, the 6-button Sega Genesis controller, I loved it. I had it. It's one of the better controllers in my opinion. And now we're at our top 3. We are at the top 3, guys. You guys, please hear me out. Please hear me out. The top 3 is the controllers that I've been using as of late, and I will continue to use, especially with me being a PC user. I have all sorts of adapters to make sure my controller works with the PC. Or for that matter, the Switch, because I'm a Switch user and a PC user now. I do have a PlayStation 4, I have an Xbox One. I plan on getting the Xbox Series X. I plan on getting the PS5, but I'm gonna wait that stuff out a little bit. But these are the controllers that I'm using now. Boxer music, you finally got a fight stick, yes. It's funny because the only Sega controller I played was an emulator for a few years ago. Being 28 was after my time. Yeah, definitely after your time. Let's see. The next controller is this is number 3, guys. This is the number 3 controller. It's the PS4 controller. The DualShock controller was the first of its kind. Then we had the PS2 DualShock controller. Then we had the PS3 controller. And then we had the PS4 controller. Nothing changed. Like literally nothing changed. So I could really, I could say the DualShock controller all the way up to the PS4 controller, it's all good. The layout is exactly, they probably tweaked it here and there, but this is like, I'm willing to say, if we're let me get my thoughts together. Sorry. I'm willing to say that this is one of the best controllers of all time. They don't modify it. They might add to it, but they don't modify it. The buttons are in the same position. The analog sticks are in the same position. The D-pad is in the same position. So as you're moving forward with PlayStation, there's nothing that you're missing. Everything feels good in the hands. Yeah? Yeah, I think we're all on the same page. Let's move on to the next one. Wait, hold on. Why mess up something? I don't disagree, Mark. I don't disagree. Do not mess up something that already. Why? Why would you mess up something that's already like good? A lot of companies mess up stuff that's already good. I like that Xbox continued to make a similar controller. They made but it wasn't the same controller. So that's why I'm not a fan of the Xbox One controller. I prefer the 360 one, and I wish they continue to move along with the 360 controller in that style. But neither here nor there. It's similar, but it's not the same. Similar, but not the same. Where the PlayStation, it's the closest to what it originally was. If that makes any sense. All right, so next one. Number 2, arcade sticks. I don't care, it's a controller. I am a huge fan of the arcade sticks. As you see, I have an arcade cabinet in front of me. I love the arcade stick. It goes well with any and every console that you have, especially if you're a fighting game connoisseur. Boxer Ninja just admitted that he finally got his arcade stick, his fight stick, whichever one you want to call it. I have the one that you see on the screen. I have this one, alongside with, I have my Mad Catz. I have a Hori. I have the original Nintendo arcade stick. I got a Neo Geo arcade. I got a lot of arcade. I have like almost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sticks. I have 7 arcade sticks. 7 arcade. I love the arcade stick. It is a great controller, and I recommend using it. I mean, even with like originally Mario was in the arcades, and guess what they were using? The arcade stick. I think it's a wonderful controller, and people should use more of it. And I always equate it to eating with the fork and chopsticks, right? When you eat with chopsticks, there's a level of finesse that's there, and it feels really good when you accomplish things playing on an arcade stick. But when you eat with the fork, it's like business as usual, and it's really easy, and you're trying to get there fast. You really take your time with chopsticks, and you really take your time with arcade sticks. I hope that analogy makes sense. And we're gonna do a whole like week series about arcade sticks and stuff like that, hopefully. But I think the arcade stick deserves a place on this list no matter what console you're using. And then finally, number 1, controller that I thoroughly enjoy and like to use. Here we go. No. It's the... Hey, Joey.
Release subscription received. Thank you for renewing your Class 2 access.
Let's go, 10 months. I got you. We got a sandwalk coming up. The GameCube controller, for me, hands down, is like one of, I'm not gonna say it's the best because this is my opinion. This isn't of all time. I didn't do a study of each and every one of these controllers and started doing a vote and doing, I didn't do that. But what I did do is use every single one of these controllers on this list at some point in my life. And the GameCube controller, I frequently use all the way up until this day. All the way up until this day. Let's see. Let's figure this out. When did it release? 2001. The GameCube controller was released 2001, and it's still being used to this day. It was used on the Wii. It was used on the Wii U, and now it's still being used on the Nintendo Switch. That's freaking crazy. This is the most viable controller that Nintendo's ever made. This controller has had a 20-year run. I was about to say it wrong. I was about to say 1. It had a 20-year run. 20-year run. And I got it. People were like, oh, but this controller, it's been used for this. No. Those controllers weren't official controllers. They weren't officially endorsed by the company. The Nintendo GameCube controller is still being endorsed by Nintendo. Nintendo is intentionally making GameCube controllers for the Nintendo Switch. Is PlayStation doing that? Like, hey, I know you guys like the DualShock controller. We're gonna make a DualShock controller for your PlayStation 4. No, they're not. They're not doing that at all. They're not doing that at all. So that's why this is number 1 on my list. I mean, it's just a great controller. And on top of that, if you go back and play some of the retro games, the controller still makes sense. And that's why it has to be on my list here. But guys, give me a second. Thanks for watching my video. I really appreciate that. Make sure you check me on Twitch, MD SOUL, MD Soul, right there on Twitch. And also make sure you follow me on my social media platforms. I'll see you next time. Peace.